Object freedom. Today's session is on this subject of object freedom. This subject is not even a subject in psychoanalysis in the traditional sense. However, this subject is at the center of spirituality and entire domain of Eastern thought. In psychoanalysis, we find Carl Jung and Winnicott dealing with this subject in some way or the other. Especially Winnicott, who wrote a very famous paper, The Capacity to Be Alone. And there it opens up this subject of object freedom, including the question, is being alone, being free from the object, or is it that the object has been so well internalized and there is an unconscious identification and relation with the object that we don't need a physical object anymore? Object freedom can be a solution to thousands of people because we are all entangled with objects in some way or the other. Objects of the past, objects of the present, and objects of the future. Object relations in reality also is object entanglement for most of us. We all want freedom from many objects we are entangled with, mostly objects of the past. In many cases, objects of the present also, especially in cases of relationships not working out. It can also be a professional area that you want freedom from a boss or a colleague, and there seems to be no way out. This leads to a point of humor where I say, we all want riddance from somebody or something. So if somebody opens up a website, riddance.com, or in Hindi, the real idea was chutkara.com, क्योंकि हर एक को किसी न किसी से छुटकारा चाहिए. वो कोई आदमी हो सकता है, कोई परिस्थिति हो सकती है, कोई संस्था हो सकती है, पर हर आदमी कहीं ना कहीं उलझा हुआ है, कहीं ना कहीं फंसा हुआ है, किसी न किसी चीज से छुटकारा चाहिए. तो chutkara.com is something which is a globally needed enterprise. On the other hand, we see that even as we talk of object freedom, as human beings, we are all desperate for objects. We are not able to bear loneliness. And therefore, many of us, in fact, most of us, dread object freedom. We want to be involved with objects. And we don't know how to be involved without being entangled. So we want to be entangled with objects because we dread loneliness even more than the consequences of entanglement with the object. In this context, we will explore the idea of object freedom today. There was an intense debate between the Freudian school and the Kleinian school whether the human mind can live without an object. Freud had postulated existence of the state of primary narcissism. That state after birth where you experience an oceanic whole and there is no other There is no subject and the object. It is just one oceanic whole. And that is the state of primary narcissism. The capability to understand I and not I has not yet developed. This is how Freud postulated it, that we start off with the state of primary narcissism and then move into the state of object relations. Kleinian school, however, disagrees, and they say there is no such state as that of primary narcissism. We are object relation creatures, and at no point in time we have a mind which is not involved in object relations. So right from birth onwards, the mind is continuously involved in object relations. Even if you don't have the sense of I and not I, even then inside of you, there are objects that are relating to each other and you identify with some of them, or you believe you are one of those objects. So the play of objects inside the mind, right from birth to death, is inseparable from the human mind. The human mind cannot operate except getting involved in object relations. I personally believe that there are states where what Freud said comes true, that there are no objects, no thoughts, no feelings, no desires, no fears. And such states are possible. In the Indian spiritual tradition, we call it the state of enlightenment, or small glimpses of that state, which are termed by different words. Patanjali calls it samapatti. In Zen, we call it satori. A micro experience of enlightenment. Some people just call them altered states or meditative states. But essentially, these are micro states of enlightenment. These states, however, are rare and beyond the reach of most of us, and therefore an exception, not the rule. The rule is we are involved in object relations most of the time. And when we go into the depth of object relations, we see object relations can be of different types. We can have a good object relation. We can have a good object relations, a good relation with an object. We can have a relation with a bad object. A good object is one that reciprocates with goodness. A bad object is one that engages with us so as to make us feel either loss, that the object can abandon us, or separate from us, or distance from us. And we experience different types of loss. It can be a temporary loss, a permanent loss, a real loss, a perceived loss, an emotional loss, a physical loss, but loss of some type. Or the bad object can make us experience an attack. The bad object can attack physically or verbally, or even non-verbally, by silence or by facial expressions or by body language, or by being good to somebody and ignoring us. So there are different types of attacks and different types of feelings of loss. A bad object makes us experience these very difficult feelings of loss and attack. Phenomena of loss and phenomena of attack. So we can have a good relation with a good object, relation with a bad object, or we can have a relation which is an object which is at times good, at times bad, or we experience the state of object freedom. I believe many times we get into states which are near to the states of primary narcissism, and in that state, we do experience object freedom in a micro way. And based upon these object relations, we can divide all our relationships into a hierarchy. Our first choice is to have a good relationship. Our second choice is to have no relationship if we cannot have a good relationship. And the last choice is to have a bad relationship. What you cannot cure, you have to endure. Now, this is the hierarchy for most people. A large group of people, not most people, large group of people, that a good relationship or no relationship or bad relationship. I should not say a large number of people, but a group of people goes by this hierarchy. A good relationship or no relationship or bad relationship. But a much larger group reverses number 2 and number 3. They go by first choice is to have good relationship, second choice is to have a bad relationship, and third choice is to have no relationship. They fear the loneliness and abandonment of no relationship far more than the suffering of a bad relationship. So they choose suffering compared to loneliness. So this is how we can divide by priority the 3 states, 3 types of relationship states. The state of a good relationship, state of no relationship, state of a bad relationship. And when we are in the state of no relationship, we pay the price of loneliness and no help and no company. So in every form of relationship, there is a cost and benefit. There are do's and don'ts. There are profits and losses. And we make overall decision based upon the overall assessment of the package. So these are the 3 normal states. The 4th state is the state of object freedom. Freedom from relationships. The freedom from relationship is very different from no relationship. When we are in the state of no relationship, we want a relationship, we need a relationship, but our cost benefit analysis tells us it is better to have a no relationship than to have a bad relationship. So we suffer this no relationship state because it is less of a suffering compared to a greater suffering of a bad relationship. I'm reminded of an old lady in an old age home. She was interviewed by a media reporter, and the reporter asked her, "Isn't it terrible to live alone at this age?" And she said, "There are things far more terrible than this, and so I have chosen this." Must have been in a very traumatic relationship before. However, we realize these are the 3 states that we are into in relationship. Good relationship, no relationship, and bad relationship. When we say object freedom, we say freedom from relationship. It is different from no relationship. This is like choosing a necessary evil and suffering the cost of it. Whereas in object freedom, we are free from the compulsion of having a relationship, and therefore we experience freedom and bliss. So these 3 are areas of pleasure and pain. Object freedom is an area of bliss. It is not an area of pleasure and pain. Between the East and the West, there is a paradigmatic difference, a difference of paradigm on this point. In the Eastern spiritual tradition, object freedom is one of the central goals. Whereas in psychoanalysis and much of Western thinking, West does not even believe this is possible, because this is like a rare experience of enlightenment, and the Western thinking has no idea about enlightenment. There is a difference between loneliness of no relationship state versus aloneness of object freedom. And this brings us to the Winnicott's idea of capacity to be alone, which Winnicott says is a sign of maturity and health. It is not a sign of pathology. This is not object avoidance. This is object freedom. It is mastery over the need, the compulsive need to have objects which enslaves us. And in the East, we have a state of enlightenment, which is freedom from all objects, inside and outside. And this is a rare experience. And the entire Eastern thought is based upon what is this state and how to get into this state. This is the center of Eastern life. Not only Eastern thinking, but Eastern life and Eastern culture. Most specifically, the Hindu culture. Now, when we say object freedom, we mean freedom from object relations in the outer world, as well as object freedom from object relations in the inner world. Because in the inner world, we create fantasy objects, both F fantasy object and PH fantasy objects. And also freedom from object relations with internalized objects of early life, freedom from all of them. Object relation school object relation school, especially of Klein, places great importance on object relations in early life as the basis of psychological health, and it goes on to the extent of even saying it is also the basis of biological health. Internalization of a good, reliable, stable object in early life is the foundation, according to this school, of psychological and biological health in later life. Kohut also talks about transmuting internalization, which happens when you really are with a good object and you internalize that good object. Kleinian theory also tells us why there are obstacles in internalizing a good object. Either the good object is not available, or there is too much of envy or rage, or the constitutional difficulty because of which internalization cannot happen. If this does not happen in early childhood, it leads to psychological trouble, at times even biological trouble, through somatization. And this then has to be handled in adult age with therapy or with good life experiences. Object freedom is not a default condition or easily achievable condition. It is a rare achievement because we are talking about enlightenment. And this requires a psychological and a spiritual journey, a deep, long-term internal journey of the inner world. One way to look at object freedom is you get into the state of object freedom by internalization of an omnipotent object, which is so good and so omnipotent that once you identify with this object, and you become one, no more object is needed, and therefore it is internalization of one omnipotent good object which enables one to go for object freedom. This is one understanding of object freedom, that it essentially is internalization of a omnipotent good object after which nothing else is required. Second way of understanding object freedom is that you get into a state where there is no need for a good object. This is difficult for psychoanalysis to accept, but in the spiritual area, some do believe in this idea that you can get into a state where there is no need for a good object, and through that you require object freedom. What object freedom does is it allows you involvement without entanglement. Normally, what we call object relations is entanglement of different types. Spirituality tells us, especially Eastern and especially Hindu spirituality, that when you are enlightened, you attain the state of object freedom, and then it's a choice whether to relate with objects or not relate to objects. And when you exercise that choice, you get into a state where there is involvement with objects but no entanglement. So object relations then qualitatively change. Object relations then have the flavor of involvement without any entanglement. What Bhagavad Gita says, Nishkam Karma, that then becomes possible. And I have dealt with it in post-enlightenment life, that if you become enlightened, then how have we seen others who are enlightened live their life? How do we analyze that post-enlightenment life? And one of the things that happens there is object freedom, no compulsive need to relate to objects, and yet one chooses to relate out of some purpose, and then there is involvement without entanglement. How do you build capacity to move towards object freedom? Winnicott calls it very rightly the capacity to be alone. Like any capacity, any faculty, any capability, you have to build this capacity slowly. It is not a default condition. The default condition is object relations, object entanglement, fear of loneliness. That is the default condition. Object freedom is not a default condition. It's a rare achievement. Also, we are fortunately not in a situation where either there is object freedom or object entanglement. Actually, there is a continuum. So we can move from object entanglement towards object freedom slowly. And that's the fortunate part of it. We are not in a binary quantum world. We are in an analog world of continuum. So how do you build capacity for object freedom? First, by doing cost-benefit analysis of the objects we are related to. Because usually we go into an affective relationship without analyzing it intellectually. When we do an intellectual cost-benefit analysis, half of the entanglement drops. Second is, by accepting the existential real situation we may have, that we may be situated in a situation where we are surrounded by very difficult objects, and not having an object relation might be the best choice for us. That might be the least suffering that we have as a choice. So deep acceptance of existential situation, and this will generally lead to part object freedom and part situation of no relationship of loneliness. But it will be slight movement away from a no relation situation, because we are accepting existentially and spiritually that either out of absurdity or out of karmic situation and self-journey situation, we are existentially in a situation where we have to profoundly accept our circumstance, and that helps us to slowly build capacity and move from loneliness to object freedom. Loneliness is a very difficult thing, and in today's society, globally, it's a pandemic, unrecognized pandemic. I believe the UK now has a cabinet minister for loneliness. I think Japan also has appointed somebody on those lines. And we have to understand this state of loneliness, because the movement will be more often than not, this is not the only movement, but one possible movement is from a state of object relation, object entanglement, to a state of disappointment and resignation. That you get into an object relation, you feel entangled, you suffer it, you are disappointed with it, you come out of it, again you get into a second one, again disappointed. After a few disappointments, you get into a state of resignation, you just give up. And then you get into a state of no relationship and you face loneliness. And from there, it is a possibility to move towards object freedom by building capacity. If we don't move on that path, then by compulsion, either we suffer loneliness or we get into a bad relationship which seems less troublesome than loneliness. And either of that is suffering. So more often than not, we are into object relation, entanglement, suffering, disappointment, resignation, loneliness, and then again back to object relation, or suffer loneliness or move towards object freedom. A realistic analysis of human beings, that good human beings are few, and compatibility with those few is even more rare. Once we realize this fact, that compatibility is an exception, not the rule, we think the other way around. We feel compatibility is the rule, incompatibility is the exception. It's actually the other way around. Compatibility is rare and exception, incompatibility is the rule and common. Once we deeply, profoundly accept this, a natural capacity inside of us activates that enables us to move towards object freedom. This is one of those intellectual insights which liberate us and enhance our capacity. Beyond says, the mind grows with the development of truth. This is one of the situations. The more profoundly we understand this truth, the more it builds our capacity for object freedom. Capacity to undertake joyful, intellectual, or creative or spiritual work. If we have an intellectual, creative, or spiritual side to us, it is easy to build capacity towards object freedom. If you don't have this part of your life active, it would be a good idea to activate it, so it helps us to build capacity for object freedom. What happens on the way? Because most of us will not reach the state of object freedom completely. We will be by and large on the continuum. So what happens is, we get into a state of austere optimum. I call it austere optimum, where we need a minimum human contact. So we figure out what is the minimum we want, and we maintain that human contact across the day. We all need a minimum communication. We figure out what we need, and we do it either by digital medium or in person. And I always say we should have this third space in our life. A space which is neither office nor home. A space where we spend at least 1 hour every day. And the condition is that space should be such that nobody from office or nobody from home comes to that space, the friends there are completely different. Such a third space, and spending 1 hour every day, is very necessary, in my opinion, for good psychological health. All these three help us to live by an austere optimum in terms of object relations, and this also means an optimum object freedom based upon our capacity at that point in time. Object freedom is a global problem, everyone's aspiration, secret aspiration, deep-seated aspiration, evolutionary aspiration, spiritual aspiration. It is an everyone's problem, that is also our problem. And as we understand it more profoundly and manage it better, we can enable with our insights everyone else in the world also how to manage this issue, this question. And obviously our insights will be helpful to those like us. But if we have a basket full of insights, everyone will be helped with some insight or another. How does spirituality help us in building capacity for object freedom? Interest in mysticism and spirituality helps us, takes us into our inner journey and into rare parts of nature, takes us away from entanglement with people. Spiritual processes like meditation, visualization, idol therapy, they help us in developing capacity for object freedom. Idol therapy particularly helps us because we can, if done properly, it helps us to internalize a good, reliable, stable, omnipotent object. Interest in energy healing systems like Reiki, pranic healing, they also help us in developing capacity for object freedom. This happens in two ways. One, they help us to get into a state of a spiritual state, a meditative state, where we don't have objects and we experience object freedom for the first time. They also help us deal with our anxiety when we don't have objects. And they help us by providing an interesting area into which we dive, leaving all the objects outside. Concept of God, especially in Hinduism, is very important because unlike Abrahamic religions where God is a strict father figure, a very punitive father figure, in Hinduism the concept of God is plural. It is left for the person, the individual, to visualize God in whatever form and with whatever qualities he likes. So one can visualize God as a friend, as a father, as a mother, as a son, as a teacher, as a lover, as a healer, whatever form one wants God to be visualized. And this enables us to visualize God, conceptualize God, have an object relations, and internalize it to build capacity. Hindu spirituality and entire Eastern spirituality has for its center the state of enlightenment as the goal. And this is a state of no thought, no objects, no affect. So the more we move towards it, more object freedom we have. One of the definitions of this enlightenment, I have talked about how this word enlightenment is used. One meaning is it's a state of no thought, no affect, no object. This is one definition of enlightenment. Second definition is It's a state of oneness with existence. And there are other definitions also. We have done that before. I won't go into it again. But when these states are our goal states and we move towards it, we develop our capacity for object freedom. And once we experience this, obviously there is a quantum jump in the capacity of object freedom. Service to humanity in a selfless way also allows us to experience involvement without entanglement. That also builds our capacity. Spirituality tells us that all object relations essentially are transitional, secondary, and mostly transactional. And that profound insight also helps us develop capacity for object freedom. And if one wants to live it out in an everyday way, on a large scale, we see experiments on a social scale which help us to move towards an optimum of object freedom. We see that in OSHO commune, where there is a very good mix of individualism and freedom, object relation and object freedom. And slowly one is expected to first experience object relation and move towards object freedom. And in OSHO commune, this is done on the path of free love and free sex. In Sri Aurobindo Ashram, it's a more traditional system which is based on self-control, celibacy. Of course, philosophies are very different. They are not comparable, but one element which is common is this. Both of them are spiritual societies in their own ways, and both of them help members move towards object freedom. And these are social scale entities, not an individual situation or individual case. So one can start living in any community of this type, any spiritual community, which helps one to develop capacity for object freedom. Thank you.